VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And welcome to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network. My name is Jim Schneider. We thank you for joining us today. We are going to have a program that is just packed full of information. We trust will be both inspiration to you as well as a challenge to you as well. Our program today is being broken up into two parts. The first half hour, we're going to be having a very special guest with us and talking about ministering to people with disabilities. And we'll cover a wide gamut of issues there. The second half of the program, we're going to be dealing specifically with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling as it came out this morning on health care. What are the implications pertaining to this vote by the court as well? So first of all, we would like to welcome to our Crosstalk studios by way of phone, Joni Eareckson Tada. She is the founder and chief executive officer of Joni Friends International Disability Center and is an international advocate for people with disabilities. She has a daily radio ministry, Joni Friends, which is celebrating 30 years of ministry. Joni, thank you for joining us today here on Crosstalk.
Well, it's good to be with you, and of course, all of our listeners on Crosstalk. Thanks for having me.
Joni, before we talk about a number of issues here, I know that you have been in a battle with cancer, and many listeners are wondering, how are you doing?
Boy, thank you for asking. That's kind of you to ask. It's interesting because I've got blood tests this week and a PET scan, and I just finished a mammogram, and so far, all tests look clear, and I'm about 20 months out from my last chemotherapy, so I'm feeling strong. I've got stamina. I'm very happy that I didn't break a bone through this procedure or get bladder infections or lung infections, all the sorts of things that quadriplegics like me are so susceptible to. Even though the demands and the rigors of chemotherapy were very strenuous, I am just in the best of health. So I thank you and the listeners for praying for me. Thanks, V, for that.
Yes, and many have been doing just that. So it's exciting to hear that wonderful report. Joni, congratulations. 30 years of ministry through Joni Friends.
Yes, I'm so excited about that. We've been on the air with Joni and Friends for some time now, and of course you guys at VCY America have just been a fantastic partners with that. But not only is the Joni and Friends radio program celebrating 30 years on the air, but next week Ken and I will be celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, 30 seems to be a great number right now.
Yeah, I've got to wait one more year for that to happen.
Good for you. Well, my husband has been my strongest advocate through this entire challenge with my cancer, and I'm so grateful to God that I've got a life partner who not only loves me, but really loves the Lord Jesus.
Joni, give us a brief history of what led to the founding of your ministry, Joni Friends.
Well, I'll take your listeners back real quickly to a time when I broke my neck back in 1967, and I was despairing, depressed, discouraged, but thankfully Christians came alongside my hospital bed and ministered the love of God in such practical ways, and it was those practical expressions of God's love that convinced me the Bible was worth listening to. And so when they opened up God's Word and read to me from Scripture, I readily listened, and I grabbed a hold of some wonderful anchors in the Bible that saw me through my deepest depression. And when I began to get my spiritual act together with the Lord Jesus, when He backed me into this corner spiritually, forcing me to consider His Lordship in my life, that's when I wrote my experiences down in a book called Joni, the Joni book. And after that, there was a movie. And after that movie, produced by Billy Graham, I began to get letters. I get letters, and so many letters from families affected by disability, just like mine. People with disabilities who were struggling with depression. They had big questions about getting their church to support their efforts. And anyway, I realized I wanted to be a good steward of this incredible response to the Joni book and the Joni movie, which is why I started Joni and Friends 30 years or more than 30 years ago. And now we have a worldwide ministry that runs retreats for special needs families all across the United States. This summer we will serve nearly 5,000 disabled children, adults, family members, volunteers at any one of our 25 family retreats, and we'll be holding 15 of those family retreats in developing nations. We take wheelchairs and Bibles around the world. Our teams just returned from China. We're going to be heading out soon for the Ukraine and Cuba. So it's a wonderful way. God has used this simple wheelchair of mine to be a platform, a launching pad for giving His gospel to the neediest of people with disabilities in some of the darkest corners of the world. And I am so honored. I am so grateful for this quadriplegia. I just don't think there would be this ministry were it not for me having broken my neck so many, many years ago, and I thank God for it.
Well, you know, Joni, the first time I ever heard you speak in public was in 1986, and the location was Washington, D.C., and you said something back then that I have not forgotten to this date, and as you were sharing your testimony and your ministry, you stated it was that you're not able to minister in spite of your disability, but because of your disability.
That's right. I often tell people I smile, not in spite of my disability, but because of it. My disability is an incredible weakness in my life. I'm physically weak. Sometimes I'm driven to emotional weakness because of the rigors of chronic pain and the demands of my quadriplegia. But the Bible promises that when we bring our weaknesses before God, we tap into His strength. So when I am weak, God is strong through me, so I can boast in my afflictions. I can delight in them. I can glory in them, as the Apostle Paul says. For then I am convinced God's power rests on me. So we shouldn't be ashamed of our weaknesses or our limitations. These are the very things that can be the platform from which God displays His most wonderful power to our friends, family, coworkers, neighbors all around us.
Joni, we have a variety of people listening right now, and there is an element of our listenership as well that knows what it's like to care for a disabled loved one. They're going through the challenges in any number of different areas. But for those who are listening who have no clue what a family goes through, could you just kind of, I know there's a wide-ranging number of disabilities, but describe for us the challenges that families face that have a disabled loved one.
Well, the day-to-day routines are so daily and never-ending. The social isolation, the financial strain, the access to good medical care, the incredible, enormous financial burden that puts on special needs families. I know for myself, even when I get up in the morning, oh my goodness, I'm facing almost a 2-hour routine of somebody giving me a bed bath, doing toileting routines, getting me dressed, cinching up my corset, putting me in a wheelchair, pushing me to the bathroom, brushing my hair, blowing my nose, brushing my teeth. The routines are just so demanding, and it's every single day. The routines never vary every single day. So you can understand why there is such a strain on marriages of children with disabilities and their moms and dads. They say that the divorce rate among parents of disabled children is almost up to 80%, and that's a tough statistic. So we're trying to reverse that statistic by providing practical help and hope from God's Word and teaching churches how to provide respite for these weary moms and dads who need help.
Does the church get it on ministering to people with disabilities, or do we have a long way to go in that regard?
I think the church gets it much more now than it ever used to, and part of the reason is there are just so many more special needs families. I mean, just look at the new statistics out for children who are now diagnosed on the autism spectrum. 1 in 88 children who are born are going to be diagnosed on the autism spectrum. That's incredible. And so we've got this burgeoning population of special needs families, children with disabilities, and the church just has to step up to the plate and not send these families to other congregations where perhaps their needs might be better met. No, I think every church has to embrace these families, because there's not a cul-de-sac in America where there's not a kid with autism. And most churches want to help, but they're just not sure what to do or where to go. And so I encourage our listeners, if they want to get their church embracing special needs families, especially children with autism, we've got lots of resources, lots of training tools to help a church get started.
And how can they access those?
Well, of course, you can visit us at joniandfriends.org. We've got lots of Joni and Friends teams scattered across the country who can come and do training in your church. But the best place to begin is by visiting our church relations page at joniandfriends.org.
Joni, perhaps, and we want our listeners to go there and look at that, but maybe you've got a few suggestions as far as some proactive steps that churches can take in ministering to people with disabilities or families that are caring for one with disabilities. What are some proactive steps that churches can take?
Well, first, some very simple steps. Number one, just welcome that new person who's in a wheelchair. Or if a member of your congregation has just given birth to a child with multiple disabilities, think of some positive things that you can do. There are all kinds of ways to extend the love of Christ to people. I'm thinking of something called a pampering day that we do. That's a Saturday morning where we train church volunteers to take care of kids with special needs so that moms get a break. And they come to the church facility, and there'll be a little salon set up where you can maybe get your nails done or get your hair cut or get a back massage. Just ways that a church can provide practical relief, practical respite to some of these mothers or their fathers is a great way to get started.
We're speaking today with Joni Eareckson Tada, the founder and chief executive officer of Joni and Friends International Disability Center. Joni, if you would, what hope can you give to a family that is caring for one who is disabled? They're tired, they're discouraged, and frankly, at times just don't know which way to turn. What hope do you have for them?
Well, I would tell them that God never intended for them to suffer alone. Nobody should have to suffer alone. It's why God created spiritual community. It's why the church exists. So I want our friends listening, if they feel alienated or isolated, if they feel overburdened by a disability in the family, please know that there is a church, there must be a church in your community that can embrace your family, that can reach out to you, because nobody should suffer alone. When we share our burdens with others, the load gets a whole lot lighter. So my encouragement would be to seek out that church in your community where you can feel like a part of the body of Christ, and not only have some of your needs addressed, but have an opportunity to serve others, because sometimes that burden can be easily lightened when you get with other moms and dads of kids with disabilities and share resources. So just know that there is spiritual community, and we at Joni and Friends want to help you find it.
Joni Eareckson Tada is our guest here today. We're going to take a quick 60-second break and come back to the second segment with our special guest today. You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, scientist and creation debater with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, insects don't have lungs, so how do they get their oxygen?
Chris, insects take in oxygen through tiny tubes in the sides of their bodies, tubes called spiracles. But these are not just openings through which oxygen can flow. They're actually able to open and close depending on how much oxygen is needed. When an insect is active, it needs more oxygen, and the tubes are open. But when it's at rest, it closes them to keep oxygen from actually doing harm. And yes, oxygen in the wrong amounts and at the wrong time can do damage. It needs to be regulated. The more I study the creation, the more amazed I am at the wisdom and power of our Creator in making it all happen. Chris, He did it all back in Genesis.
If you would like to learn more about science from a Christian perspective, please visit us on the web at www.icr.org. That's www.icr.org.
Our guest today is Joni Eareckson Tada from Joni Friends, and we are celebrating, we're celebrating with them 30 years of ministry on the radio, and some special, just a special occasion it is, and certainly we're talking about the church ministry to people with disabilities and related topics as well. Joni, earlier today, the U.S. Supreme Court came out with their ruling dealing with the topic of the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, and I know that you have a special watchful eye for matters as it pertains to people with disabilities. Any comment pertaining to this ruling?
Well, it's so early yet. Of course, I haven't had a chance to really dig into it. I can say this. All socialism has its beginnings in some kind of entitlement, and with this decision today by the Supreme Court, we now have a whole new social order in America. And, of course, that concerns me. What separated America for over 200 years has been its sense of personal freedom and personal choice and liberties. But that's going to change now. However, as far as people with disabilities are concerned, yes, there could be some positive changes, but, yes, there are some alarming changes. You see, in the past, of course, the fault of our former system of health care coverage is that private entities were the ones who determined, who gets coverage and to what extent. And coverage was not universal, and that excluded a lot of people with disabilities. It meant that people with the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis or cancer were, for the most part unable to secure health care coverage. But now that's changed. However, and here's the big however, and this is what I want our listeners to understand. With that change, now comes a new inequity for special needs families, because the inequity is now that instead of private entities, it'll be the federal oversight committees who will now determine who gets coverage and to what extent. And sure, some people with disabilities may enjoy more coverage, or at least coverage for the first time, but there are other people with very significant catastrophic disabilities. I'm thinking of ventilator-dependent quadriplegic friends of mine who might not fare well under a federal oversight committee who is zealously guarding rationing of health care dollars. So in one sense, my instincts tell me that, yes, this will mean more special needs families, more people with diagnoses of multiple sclerosis, spinal cord injury, cancer, Huntington's disease, etc., might enjoy coverage. However, with the federal oversight committees, unfortunately, I think a lot of elderly people with secondary disabilities and a lot of people with catastrophic disabilities just won't get the health care that they desperately need. That concerns me.
Joni, and by the way, listeners, we'll be covering this much more extensively in the next half hour here with attorney Matt Staver. But, Joni, it really brings up the value of human life. And just recently they announced another whole new series of tests coming out to determine if an unborn child has a disability, so parents can decide whether or not to abort the child. I understand also today in Strasbourg, France, there is a conference that's been called for by the leaders of human rights organizations across the European Union to create a strategy to battle the idea that killing the disabled is a human right. Are we venturing beyond the point where we ought to when we start doing these tests for the purposes of whether life should live or not?
You know, it's interesting. It's a great question, Jim, because ever since back in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve plucked that fruit off the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I think we now are experiencing the repercussions of that in a much more challenging way, because all knowledge, all technology has great potential for good, but also great potential for harming us, for evil. It's a good thing. It's a wonderful thing that we can diagnose some of these conditions in preborn infants. Good in that they can be medically treated, there can be early intervention, there can even be some surgical procedures performed on unborn children. So having these diagnoses is great. However, what it means on the flip side of the coin is that now parents have access to much more information and are making decisions that, I don't think we want to raise a child with a disability. And, of course, that's why now we see these astronomical statistics where 9 in every 10 children, unborn children diagnosed with Down syndrome, are now being aborted. That's genocide among a whole population of people with Down syndrome, who, incidentally, are some of the most lovable, well-adjusted people, and yet our society is just flinging open the door and giving parents not only access to more information, but encouraging them even to abort. And that really breaks my heart.
It was just over 7 years ago, too, we saw a judge make a very horrendous decision that pulled food and hydration from Terry Schindler-Shivo. 14 days later, after being denied food and water, she died. Your ministry at Joni and Friends has pointed out to the importance of having something called an advanced healthcare directive. Is this still an issue today?
Well, there's hardly a hospital that you can go in for treatment nowadays where they do not require you to have an advanced health care directive. And I think an advanced health care directive is a good thing, especially in light of so many questions, so many end-of-life complexities that that technology has forced upon us. I think it's good to sit down with your pastor, sit down with your husband and wife, your family, your physician with whom hopefully you share the same life values, and discuss how you want to be treated in case you become mentally incapacitated toward the end of your life, or in case you become mentally incapacitated from a catastrophic injury. I think advanced healthcare directives are a very good thing, but there can even be abuse in that, and so we need to, people need to be very careful about who they designate their healthcare proxy to make certain that the person representing you, should you become mentally incapacitated, shares your life values, shares your convictions, shares your life principles, and really will reflect your wants and wishes regarding healthcare treatment in case you cannot make decisions.
Well, Joni, you're celebrating 30 years on the radio now. Your ministry has taken off. You've really expanded beyond the borders here in the United States. Tell us what you're doing through Joni and Friends.
Well, right now my husband and I are traveling to a lot of college campuses across the country. We were recently at Gordon Conwell Seminary and Dallas Theological Seminary, Cedarville University. I was just at Biola University. And our heart's desire here at Joni and Friends, Ken and I want to use our efforts and energies to reach a young generation, the new generation, for the passion of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Get them excited about sharing the gospel with people who don't often darken the door of a church, with people who are forgotten overseas in some of these developing nations where there's so much abuse and there is no right to life for people with disabilities. People with disabilities are euthanized systematically. Children with disabilities are discarded or killed at birth. And we want young people to understand that disability ministry is a life and death ministry, and it's something that needs their prayers and needs their involvement and needs their commitment.
And your international ministry, Wheels for the World?
Yep, well, we continue to take these wheelchairs all around the world. I'm so excited that, like I said earlier, we just got back from China, delivering hundreds of wheelchairs and Bibles in China, of all places, and doing disability ministry training among house church pastors. And it's just remarkable how a wheelchair gives us so much entree into a whole population of people who, under at least the communist system there in China, just have nothing. They have absolutely nothing. And we're just so grateful that we've been given access to reach these people for Christ and to give them wheelchairs.
People listening today may find they've got a wheelchair, a walker, some other piece of equipment that's just gathering dust in a closet or a basement. Can you put these things to use?
Oh, absolutely. We take any used but serviceable wheelchair, and all our friends listening need to do is to go to joniandfriends.org and click on our Wheels for the World page, and then scroll down to click on the email address of a wheelchair collection person who lives in your region, and we'll give you all the instructions you need to get that wheelchair to us, or we will come and pick it up. joniandfriends.org. And one other matter, you've got ministry going on over the summer months, something called family retreats. How are they going? Oh, my goodness. I just got back from our family retreat up in New England, and Ken and I had such a blast. I went kayaking for the very first time. In fact, when our friends listening go to joniandfriends.org, go over to Johnny's Corner, my personal page on our website, and you'll see a great photograph of Ken and me in a kayak on a beautiful, pristine, big lake up in New Hampshire. It was such fun.
And you have these retreats going throughout the summer.
Yep, 25 across the United States. We do need people to volunteer to assist us, to help us with these special needs families, and you can get more information on how you can volunteer, again, by visiting joniandfriends.org.
Well, Joni, we sure appreciate you carving some time out here for Crosstalk today, and we want to give you a wholehearted congratulations of 30 years of ministry on the radio and also 30 years of marriage to Ken.
So much, Jim, and of course we're so grateful for all that you guys do at VCY America Radio Network. You all at Crosstalk and at VCY just do a fantastic job of keeping Christians informed and up to date on current issues, and that means a lot to me personally.
Great. Well, God bless you, Joni. Thanks for spending time with us here today.
Okay, Jim. Blessings on you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
That was Joni Eareckson Tada from Joni and Friends, 30 years of broadcast ministry and also 30 years of marriage, and focusing in on how you can minister to people with disabilities just as they are doing so as an organization. Their website, keep in mind, is joniandfriends.org. That's joniandfriends.org. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling this morning. Here's what Nancy Pelosi had to say.
Earlier this morning, I met with our caucus after the decision was announced. It was, as you know, no surprise to us. We knew that we thought that we were on solid grounds in terms of interstate commerce, solid grounds in terms of the Constitution. It was just a question of what the vote would be. And with that confidence, we happily embraced the decision that came down. Now we can move forward to the full implementation of the law, and when that happens, for the American people, the best is yet to come. I want to say a word about Senator Kennedy. I spoke to Vicki Kennedy this morning and to Patrick Kennedy before coming here, thanking them for the important role that he played, a lifetime of commitment to making health care a right, not a privilege, in our country. He called it the great unfinished business of our country, of our society. I knew that when he left us, he would go to heaven and help pass the bill. And now I knew he was busily at work until this decision came down, inspiring one way or another. And now he can rest in peace. His dream for America's families has become a reality.
Nancy Pelosi speaking about Ted Kennedy. Went to heaven to help pass the bill. We're going to be talking with attorney Matt Staver here after the break. You're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network.
there are three major events that changed history forever. They are creation, the fall, and the flood. These, combined with the promise of Christ, are all rooted in the book of Genesis. Yet many in the church are treating these cornerstones of the Christian faith as allegory, which only sows confusion and undermines faith in the accuracy of the Bible itself. In the book, The Big Three, Dr. Henry Morris III reveals how the Scriptures negate the concept of theistic evolution, why a living faith and a saving faith exemplify a solid belief in a special creation, and the connection between the creation, the fall of man, and the flood, and how these pivotal events led to Christ, and eventually the cross. The book is a call to return to a confident trust in God's Word. To obtain your copy of The Big Three, send a donation of $13 or more to VCY America, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. To donate by phone, call 1-800-729-9829. That's 1-800-729-9829.
And you're listening to Crosstalk on the VCY America Network. As many of us stood by this morning waiting upon the U.S. Supreme Court decision, a 5-4 vote affirming and upholding the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. With us right now by way of telephone is Matt Staver, the founder and president of Liberty Counsel and the dean of the Liberty University School of Law. Matt, thanks for joining us today. Your comment here on the U.S. Supreme Court ruling.
It's stunning. In fact, it is just completely unexpected. It's a ruling from the left field that no one anticipated because Congress passed this, and the statute says that its authority was being derived under the Commerce Clause, the ability to regulate interstate commerce, not the Taxing and Spending Clause. And the argument before the United States Supreme Court was focused almost exclusively on the Commerce Clause. There's probably 50 words during the oral argument that were dedicated to even talking about the Taxing and Spending Clause. Out of 3 days of oral argument, 6 hours, and about half of that, many words, that were dedicated in the government's brief on this issue. So it was really focused on this one issue, the Commerce Clause. And so it was a 5-4 ruling that the Commerce Clause does not give the authority to Congress. And Roberts sided with Kennedy and the others.
Kennedy was... wasn't Kennedy on the side with the minority?
He was, and with regards to the Taxing and Spending Clause.
Okay.
But on the Commerce Clause, Roberts sided with Kennedy and Scalia and Thomas and Alito, and it was a 5-4 majority that the Commerce Clause does not give the Congress the authority. But then he jumped ship when it came over to taxing and spending, and he sided over with the left liberal justices on that issue, and it's just stunning. And there's very little analysis in the decision itself as to why it would be justified under taxing and spending. Plus, it's inconsistent internally. Remember, the first day of argument was on the Anti-Injunction Act. That's a federal law that says if it's a tax that you're challenging, you have to first pay the tax and ask for the refund before you can file suit. Until that time, the courts have no jurisdiction to entertain your lawsuit. And, of course, here the court said the Anti-Injunction Act doesn't apply, but, by the way, it's a tax. You can't have it both ways. Mm-hmm. If it's a tax, the Anti-Injunction Act applies. That means that you have to pay the tax, which means this court has no jurisdiction until the tax is imposed and paid and then a refund sought, which would have to wait until sometime after 2014. But here they say it's no Anti-Injunction Act doesn't apply, but by the way, it's a tax. It's absolutely unbelievable. And then Roberts says that even though Congress didn't say it was a tax and they called it something else, they called it a penalty, he's still going to denominate it as a tax. So they ignore the congressional intent. They ignore the clear language of the statute itself. They ignore the fact that the Anti-Injunction Act would divest them of jurisdiction if it were a tax, and they come down and say, by the way, it's a tax. This makes no logical or legal sense whatsoever.
Didn't then Justice Roberts, by making this declaration, in essence changing the legislation as drafted by Congress, wasn't he in essence legislating then from the bench?
He was. I mean, this is judicial activism from the Chief Justice of the United States, who said that he ought to be an umpire rather than try to throw the game. What he's done in this case is he's thrown the game. He's not acting as an umpire as he said he would during his confirmation hearings. It could have been worse, however. I mean, as bad as this decision and as stunning as this decision is, It could have been worse. What could have been worse is you could have had one of the justices, one more, say that it's upheld under the Commerce Clause. And shockingly, we have 4 of them up there that say Congress can force you to purchase something to push you into the stream of commerce even when you don't want to. Today it can be health insurance. Tomorrow it can be joining a health club or eating green vegetables or buying a particular car, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Congress has this expansive authority. If they had upheld it under the Commerce Clause, we would have had a different America. We were one vote away from having a different America where Congress has unlimited authority to force you to do whatever it chooses to do. Good news is we dodged that bullet. The good news also is, I think, that at the end of the day, this will energize people of all different kinds of persuasions and make them ultimately want to go to the polls. As 2008, I think, gave us Obamacare, 2012 will take it away.
Matt, President Obama all along insisted this is not a tax, and today the Supreme Court insisted it is a tax. Rather amazing because it really changes the legislation as we saw it. The president of Americans for Limited Government, Bill Wilson, in response to this ruling said, quote, "The U.S. Constitution died today." Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
I agree. I think that one of the things that this decision does is undermine the American people's confidence in the rule of law at the United States Supreme Court. If anything, this shows that it's just a bunch of political games that they're playing up there, and we really have no rule of law because they're not following the constitutional principles, and I think the Constitution suffered today as a result of this decision. That's why I think what we need, consequently, as a result of that, as a result of this constitutional death, as a result of this undermining the confidence of the American people in the Supreme Court, I think it pushes you back to the fact that elections do have consequences. Mm-hmm. And we need the right people in office to not only nominate, but to vote in favor of justices on the U.S. Supreme Court that will respect the rule of law. You know, in this case, beyond all the other things that are going on, Kagan should have recused herself, and it really focuses and highlights that particular issue well. If she had recused herself, you would have had a 5-4 vote in our favor on the Commerce Clause and a 4-4 tie on the taxing and spending, meaning that there would be no majority, and therefore the Commerce Clause ruling would ultimately be the ruling of the day. And she recused herself from so many other cases when she had very little involvement. She had significant, I think, involvement in this case based upon what we found, enough to make her recuse herself. But she didn't. And I think she didn't because this was the plum. This was Obama's signature piece. But I think today's decision will essentially put a millstone around Obama's neck because although he promoted this as not a tax, he wasn't going to raise taxes on the middle class. Well, guess what? The court now says it's a tax, and now it's the biggest tax in American history, and it's a tax directly not just on the middle class, but on everyone else as well.
Matt, you made reference to this presidential race, that it matters who is there because of the appointment of justices and so on. Yet we saw Justice Roberts surprise everyone by his vote today, who was appointed by George W. Bush.
I know, and I think that's a very problematic situation as well. You know what you find is if you go back in history, look at the justices appointed by Democratic presidents. They have been consistently voting liberal. You look at the justices appointed by Republicans, and some of them vote conservatively with the Constitution's intent, and some of them don't. And I think that underscores something. When you have a Democrat in office as president, they're going to really push the more ideological people that they want to have on the bench. They're not afraid to. You've got a Ginsburg, who was formerly a member of the ACLU and litigating with the ACLU. Can you imagine a Republican president wanting to appoint somebody who litigated with ACLJ or Liberty Counsel or some of the other conservative religious liberty groups? They don't have the backbone. We need to have people in office that have the backbone to put in office and nominate the people that are consistent with our values, and certainly with those, in this case, that would be respectful of the Constitution.
Matt, does this decision today also uphold the rules of Obamacare, such as the forced coverage for, the sterilizations, birth control, and other controversial matters?
Yeah, that's all still in effect. Now, Liberty Counsel, we filed our the first lawsuit on the very first day that this was signed into law, the first private lawsuit on March 23, 2010, on behalf of Liberty University. In that lawsuit, which the court will conference tomorrow, because it's at the Supreme Court and it's been held pending this case, they'll send it back down to the Court of Appeals. In that particular case that we have still pending, we raised the First Amendment free exercise clause because of the forced abortion funding. At that point, the government said, well, we really don't know if it's going to have abortion funding. We said, yes, it will. The lower court said, I don't think it's going to have abortion funding. We said, yes, it will, and the court disagreed. But now we know for a fact it has abortion funding because of the HHS mandates. Mm-hmm. So our case will still be viable. It'll still go forward on the First Amendment free exercise clause. But if it were successful, it's not going to knock down the whole legislation. It would knock it down as it relates to people who have moral and religious objections because of the abortion funding. I think in the meantime what we have to do is we have to change the complexity of Congress to get enough people to repeal or defund Obamacare.
What are the implications of the Supreme Court vote this morning economically in regard to the future of health care and politically speaking? Let's start with economically. What are the implications economically regarding this ruling?
Well, economically, the first and most prominent area you're going to see this is within the individual states with the Medicaid funding. There are states that are going to have their Medicaid rolls increased up to 20 to 50%, and they just simply can't afford it. You're going to see that having an immediate effect in the next year if this particular law is not repealed. The second thing is you're going to see it on individual taxes because this is a tax and everyone will pay, and no one's going to be exempt from this tax. Even the middle class will be part of this huge tax increase. And in fact, for example, even at Liberty University, in preparation for this Obamacare, there are some things that they've had to cut back on. In terms of how much you can deduct in your various medical savings accounts. And every other insurance program around the country is going to do that as well. And so you're going to start to feel the impact on this. I think health care costs will actually go up, not down. I think the quality will go down, not up. And you're going to have rationing under this particular situation as well because of the economic impact.
Okay, so the impact on health care is going to be rationing of it then?
Oh, no question. I mean, you've got these review boards, and they're all about rationing. You've got Ezekiel Emanuel, who was advising the president regarding this issue. He believes in the closed or the complete lives theory, which means that you put your health care dollars in the ages between 13, 14, and 40. Up until that age, you don't know whether someone is going to live a complete life. After 40, your health care costs increase, productivity, according to his theory, is that you're less productive. So therefore, you put your health care dollars in the middle. And then you also ration out people with various kinds of conditions. That's what's going to happen in this because once you have this bureaucratic system, it becomes so economically unfeasible and unwieldy that you no longer can have the kind of care that we've enjoyed in the past. You've seen that in Europe. You see it in Canada, and that's why you have these medical flight situations where people leave the area, leave the country, in order to get medical care because they can't get it inside their country.
Matt, just over 4 months from now, of course, we have the presidency election at stake here, and I want you to just discuss the implications of this decision this morning, politically speaking. We've got the U.S. presidency here at stake. We've got every member of the U.S. House, 435 members in the House. 1/3 of the U.S. Senate is up for election. Do you see this as being a major campaign issue leading up to November?
Huge campaign issue. I think that this was the worst-case scenario for President Obama and for those that supported this Obamacare. The reason is because if they had upheld it under the Commerce Clause, that would have been hugely unpopular as well, and it would be bad politically. But if you ultimately change the complexity of the House and the White House in the fall, you'd still have this unwieldy precedent that if Congress can do it here in healthcare, they can do it in other places. And so the precedent would still be there. Congress's authority to regulate or push you into certain areas of life or purchases would still be there under the Supreme Court's ruling. But what we have is the ruling on taxing and spending. And that, I think, will be the millstone around President Obama's neck. I think it is very politically unpopular. We can overturn that through the legislative process, and we won't have any continuing negative effect at the Supreme Court after that's done.
Matt Staver with us. We're going to take a quick 60-second break and come back to the final segment of Crosstalk. You're listening to the VCY America Network.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I am Brandon House. Our website is worldviewweekend.com. Today, we look at number 15 on our list of 20 characteristics of false teachers. Number 15 is false teachers cause personal and doctrinal division within the church. Romans 16, verse 17 speaks to this. Now I urge you, brethren, note those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to doctrine which you learned, and avoid them. So indeed, false teachers cause personal and doctrinal division within the church. Jude 19. These are sensual persons who cause divisions, not having the Spirit. You know what? It's okay to have divisions when it's us standing on God's Word. 1 Corinthians 11:18. There must be divisions among you to know who is approved of God. Yes, false teachers cause division, and when we stand against false teachers, we sometimes cause division because we're standing on the truth of God's Word, and that is okay. It's okay to cause division when you're standing for biblical truth.
You're listening to Crosstalk here on VCY America. We're right now speaking with Matt Staver, the founder and president of Liberty Counsel. Their website is lc.org, lc.org. The Supreme Court this morning upholding the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, in a 5-4 vote, with the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Roberts, in essence legislating from the bench, changing the legislation in order to uphold the legislation. Matt, many have been concerned, as Nancy Pelosi said, we need to pass this so we can find out what's in it. And there have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages that have been drafted, the rules and policies. With this decision that transpired this morning, do you believe it's going to be full steam ahead for new policies and rules to be drafted to implement Obamacare to a much greater extent even prior to the November elections?
Oh, I think that's what this president will do in this administration, no question, with the HHS Secretary, Kathleen Sebelius. They're going to go full steam ahead to really force this issue and try to get it as far moving forward as they can. That's what they've done even up to this point in time, but now they're going to go at frenetic speed to get this moving as far along the path. And then the argument's going to be, how can we ring the bell, because we're this far down the path? The fact of the matter is we still have a lot to go to implement this, and we haven't even begun to feel the impact of this yet until it really comes to full fruition. So no matter how far it gets implemented between now and November, it still needs to be repealed, and we need to undo Obamacare.
And every state's having to deal with it. Our own governor, Scott Walker, came out this morning with a statement saying that he is not implementing anything. He's waiting for to see if there's a change in the leadership here, Congress, the Senate, the White House, whatever it might be, come November. But he's not doing anything. No decisions till after November election to keep from implementing it here in our own state.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's the smart decision. That's the smart money on any of these states. I would not spend any time at all implementing Obamacare in any of the states, because I think likely this will be either defunded by the new Congress when they take office in 2013, or repealed if we have enough in both the Senate and the House, 2/3 in both those houses, in order to repeal it. We need 2/3 in the Senate. We need 2/3 in the House. I think we have that in the House. We just need that many more in the Senate to ultimately repeal it. But in the meantime, Congress can defund it. And if you defund it, it just is an empty shell that can't go anywhere.
We have just over 4 minutes left. And, Matt, I want to bring up one other issue because it's rather breaking news right now. As we speak, there's another major matter that's looming, and that is a vote coming up sometime later this afternoon, early evening. They're in debate at this very moment in the House of Representatives on contempt charges against the United States Attorney General Eric Holder. Your comment on the issue?
He ought to resign. He is the worst attorney general that I've known of in my lifetime and in the history of America that we can have recorded history of. Certainly he is an attorney general who's politically motivated. He uses his position in an abusive way. We've seen it firsthand where he tried to go after an innocent pro-lifer in Florida that had done nothing wrong, and he used the power of the federal government to come against her. We successfully defended her. With his Fast and Furious, he has been loose and evasive, and I think in many respects he is a very politically motivated Attorney General. Now, all Attorney Generals are political appointments. They're appointed by the President. They're nominated by the President and confirmed. No question that they may have allegiances to a particular party or viewpoint. But as the top law enforcement officer of the country, you need to make sure that you run your office with integrity, consistent with law. This Attorney General has not done that at all. He needs to be, I think he ought to be held in contempt, but I think he also should resign or be impeached.
The President, President Obama, has claimed executive privilege on the documents pertaining to Fast and Furious. Does this imply that the President was involved with Fast and Furious?
You know, I wonder about that because there's obviously something to hide within the Attorney General's office and or the President's office himself. You know, on the one hand, he says, we're going to have a separation of powers, executive privilege. On the other hand, he oversteps. He says, if Congress is not going to act, I'm going to act. And he steps on congressional power. So he's trying to have it both ways. But the very fact that he's raising this executive privilege is really disturbing because there doesn't appear to be any reason for him to do so. If he wanted to do that, he should have done it at the very beginning. But when he got to the very end and he's now facing contempt, he raises this issue. I think this issue may go clearly all the way up to the Attorney General, but may even go all the way up to the President of the United States. Fox
News is reporting that several Democrats plan to join the Republicans in voting for contempt charges, especially Dems that are in districts that their election is up in the air at this point. How significant is that matter?
It's very significant when you have people switching. They're not just going to be voting according to party lines. I think it's very significant. I think anybody of any objectivity would vote to hold Eric Holder in contempt. You can't have this kind of activity where we're actually giving guns to drug cartel and drug runners, and then have those guns end up killing our own law enforcement officers without having some transparency, and he refuses to give any kind of good information, and his story is inconsistent, and it changes, and it's actually contradictory. That situation ought to be won, even if he didn't have any knowledge about it. He should have resigned because the buck stops with him. He should have done the respectful thing early on and resigned, even if he had nothing to do with it. But the fact of the matter is, with his evasiveness and contradictory statements, I think he has something to do with it, and I think he ought to be held in contempt, and I think he ought to resign or be impeached.
If he is found in contempt, what happens next?
Well, if he's found in contempt, that's a criminal. That opens up a lot of avenues. His bar license could ultimately be in jeopardy. He could be a target of additional prosecutorial actions as well.
Who does that?
Well, in this case, if he's held in contempt, they might be able to go get a special prosecutor themselves and have someone prosecute this individual, this Attorney General. He's not above the law. Even though he might want to think he's above the law, this is a country where even the king is under the law, if you will. And that doesn't exempt the Attorney General of the United States of America.
A momentous day in Washington, D.C., and for the whole of the nation as well. It's been a momentous week. Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel, thanks for being with us. Again, the website where our listeners can obtain more information.
They can go to lc.org. It's just two letters, lc.org. lc.org is the website.
Matt, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel here, talking about the implications of the vote today by the U.S. Supreme Court. And as we speak right now, discussions, argument, testimony going forth in the U.S. Congress pertaining to contempt charges against the U.S. Attorney General. Thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.